Step away from the scripture. Nothing to see here, folks. Paul begins our passage from his first letter to the church in Corinth by saying, "Now, concerning food sacrificed to idols." Immediately, we distance ourselves from what Paul is about to say. We don't even slow down, we just speed past, no rubbernecking. Food sacrifices, specifically ritual animal sacrifices, are not a part of our religious practice. Paul's teaching sounds irrelevant. This irrelevance, however, is what makes Paul's teaching here accessible in a unique way. Since food sacrificed to idols does not play an important role in our daily life, we can be dispassionate about the issue at hand and step back far enough to observe the logic and argument that Paul uses here. Back in the day, pagan temples and shrines were more prevalent in Corinth than Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts in downtown Chicago. It's hard to believe, I know. Animal sacrifices were made at these shrines to court and favor and to appease the god or goddess. A young goat to Athena to assure a suitable husband is found for your daughter. And then down the block to offer a couple of doves to Bacchus to aid in your grape harvest. The meat from these animal sacrifices was sold in the local markets. There was no such thing as a pagan-free butcher. Within the Christian community in Corinth, there seems to have been an insider group who believed they possessed a wisdom or knowledge that others did not. They felt secure in their belief in the one true God and were not troubled by eating meat sacrificed to gods that did not really exist. Paul tells us that there were other, perhaps newer Christians who saw this meat as defiled and felt that they could not eat the meat offered to pagan gods and at the same time be a follower of Christ. This created a huge coffee hour problem. Well, actually, it was more like a potluck problem, but you get my drift. The historical anthropologists who have studied this text believe that there were communal meals that took place after worship at which meat was served. If you were among those who felt that the meat was defiled and that eating it was unchristian, you were essentially excluded from the social life of your church and from Corinthian society. Paul argues that if we use our knowledge to better ourselves as individuals, we are merely puffing ourselves up. God intends for our knowledge to be used to build up the community. Paul never, ever talks about a Christian as an independent individual. Being a Christian means you are grafted into a network of relationships that connect you with all other Christians. For Paul, a Christian does not make decisions based on his or her individual needs and desires. The needs of the community are always placed first. So Paul, who admits that eating meat offered to idols does not trouble him, says he would rather not eat meat than risk becoming a stumbling block for a Christian not yet secure in their faith. From this distance, we can see that Paul is talking about a whole lot more than meat. Last week, the Church of England consecrated their first female bishop. Libby Lane is now the Bishop of Stockport. Tomorrow, Philip North will be consecrated the Bishop of Burnley in the Church of England. He refuses to let any bishop who has laid hands on a female priest or bishop lay hands on him, lest his line in the historic episcopate become tainted. He says he does not want his consecration to offend those traditionalists who do not believe in women's ordination. For centuries, this very piece of scripture has been justifiably quoted to urge caution and restraint in the councils of the church when change is being considered. But when we wield scripture in such a way, we very quickly realize that it is a double-edged sword. Notice that when Paul advises some members of the church to forego their freedom lest they become a stumbling block for the weak, Paul is not trying to protect the weak from being offended. Paul is trying to protect the weak from imitating a behavior that would be harmful to them, something that would impede a whole and healthy relationship with God. Unfortunately, the fear of offending others has caused some church people to tiptoe through life. They have catered to the whims of every moralist or legalist who raised a voice. They have kept silent in the face of injustice. In so doing, they have missed Paul's point. If the Church of England waited for all the Philip Norths of the world to cease taking offense at women's ordination, Libby Lane would never be a bishop. Paul never hints that conflict and conversation over the consuming food offered to idols should be avoided. In fact, in his letters, Paul consistently argues for the church as a forum for such conversations. Paul asks us to take seriously how our behavior will influence the behavior of others. The Episcopal Church has been ordaining women for 40 years and consecrating female bishops for 26 years. So we can feel a bit removed from this issue as well. So let's get a little closer to Paul's teaching. How might meat sacrificed to idols almost 2,000 years ago affect our daily lives? Several years ago, when I was serving in another community north of Chicago, I was called to the principal's office for a conversation about teenage drinking and alcohol abuse. The principal had been in his job for less than a year, and already he had processed more alcohol policy violations in 1 year at our local high school than he had in the 7 years he was principal at his previous school. I was the only clergy person in the room and had been invited because the principal knew I had some skin in this game. In the previous 6 months, in my congregation alone, I had 2 students suspended for alcohol violations and another who almost died of alcohol poisoning. After about 45 minutes or so of discussing the merits of various educational programs, the principal asked me if I had something to offer. I nodded and said, "We will not solve the teen drinking problem until we address the adult drinking problem." I described going to a Little League game where cocktails were being served in the bleachers. The principal told of attending the local Memorial Day parade where a parent offered him what he thought was a glass of lemonade, only to discover it was spiked with vodka. People in the room started nodding and shared their stories. Finally, one of the social workers whose family had lived in town for 4 generations said, "It has always been this way. The unspoken message is, if you want to have fun, you have to have a drink in your hand." Now, we knew we were treading on thin ice, so we called together a group of core parent leaders and proposed our idea of talking to parents about considering how their own drinking habits influence their teenage children. There was an eerie silence in the room when we finished our presentation. The principal asked for some feedback. One person said, "Well, it sounds like a good idea." Another person said, "Well, it'll be an uphill battle." Then one woman stood and said, No, that idea will never fly. We have family and friends over to our house every Sunday afternoon. We have drinks. Everyone has fun. There has never been a problem. It is good for our children to see everyone coming together and enjoying each other's company. People will never be willing to make that kind of sacrifice. Sacrifice. An interesting choice in words. Sacrifice literally means to make sacred. When we make sacrifices to build up the relationships in our lives, we are honoring those relationships as sacred. Paul says, those who follow Christ must be willing to forego freedoms, to make sacrifices for that which is sacred. What is sacred to you?